Hi everybody, I'm Ryan. Today we're going to do a deep dive on 4-color Rhinos in Modern, which has sat for the last few months in low tier 1, high tier 2, challenging some of the best decks and having good matchups against most of the best decks. In this deep dive, we're going to be covering the overall strategy of the deck, how to play the deck, card choices and flex slots within the deck, common play patterns, and how to sideboard against the decks that I think are playable in Modern. So without further ado, let's jump into it. So this is my 4-color Rhinos deck in Modern, and we'll talk about card choices in just a second, but I wanted to use my list to talk about the overall strategy of the deck. So give me 1 second to sort of redo this. So the point of the deck is to cast one of these Cascade cards in Shardless Agent or Violent Outburst. For some reason, it's not letting me zoom in, so that's annoying. Both of these cards allow us to cascade into Crashing Footfalls every single time, because Crashing Footfalls is the only thing that costs less than 3. It costs 0. And it lets us create 2 4/4 green Rhino creature tokens with trample as early as turn 2 because of Gemstone Caverns, but normally turn 3. And that is the core of the deck. The rest of the deck is to support that game plan. Now we have Murktide Regent to be able to have an additional threat, especially if they have a lot of interaction with specifically this plan in like Teferi Time Raveler or something like that. We have Counter Magic, Force of Negation being particularly good, where if it's not our turn, we can play it for free, which means on turn 3, we can pass the turn, cast Violent Outburst on our opponent's turn, and be able to Force of Negation their interaction, and even Mystical Dispute because a lot of the interaction is blue. And then this pile of cards is our additional interaction with our opponent's game plan. Dead and Gone is like our pseudo 1-mana removal spell because we technically can't play 1-mana removal spells, so we have to play something like this. The Gone part is particularly good against like opponent Murktide Regents and things like that. Fire Ice we're playing for this initial early interaction. One really cool thing that you can do with Fire Ice is at the end of our opponent's turn, or really at the beginning of their turn, icing down an opponent's land so that it's even harder for them to interact, and then untapping and then comboing. It's pretty cool. Flame of Honor is just additional draw, additional removal, additional artifact removal. We're never going to trigger the wizard requirement, so we're only going to do one of these things. But these effects at instant speed can be really cool and really versatile. And as note, Fire Ice and Flame of Honor allows us to cast Subtlety and Fury, which we'll talk about in just a moment. Dead Gone allows us to cast Fury. So even if these cards are dead in our hands, they're not dead overall in the game. Speaking of Subtlety and Fury, we're playing for Subtlety. Subtlety allowing us to interact with our planeswalkers and creatures. This is mostly for Teferi Time Raveler. The reason Teferi Time Raveler is such an issue for our deck is that it makes it so we can only cast things that when you could cast a sorcery, and when you cast a cascade spell, even if it's at sorcery speed, the thing you're cascading into is entering the stack when something else is on the stack, which is not when you could cast a sorcery. So making sure we can always answer Teferi is important, especially as Teferi becomes even more popular. But Subtlety kind of doubles as additional interaction with our opponent's game plan. Fury, again, is a resolved Teferi protection, but also can interact with our opponent's game plan by removing their creatures. And same thing with Brazen Borrower, which can kind of double as a threat. Petty Theft being able to remove that Teferi or remove creatures and interact with them, and then sort of double as a threat. That's the overall strategy of this deck and my list. However, there's a lot of card choices to be made. Now, this is a list with no flex slots in the deck at all. You need to at least play these 54 cards in the main deck, maybe some changes to the lands, and at least these 8 cards in the sideboard. This is the stock part of the deck. The rest of it, is kind of debatable. The reason this is stock is because you need this in order to combo. You need this for your lands, and casting Lorien Revealed is also fine. You need this to interact, and then frankly, you need these split cards in order to interact with them. Whoops, messed that up. In order to interact with them very early. Subtlety being further interaction. As far as our sideboard goes, having these additional Furies for the Teferis or the creature decks is important. Endurance for the graveyard decks is important. And Force of Vigor for artifacts and enchantments, especially as Beans becomes more popular, is also important. Now, as far as actual flex slots in the deck, we kind of have to choose between these cards. So when you're building your 4-color Rhinos deck, you kind of just have to pick 6 of these and 7 of these, and that is your deck, depending on what decks you're attempting to attack, what your playstyle is, etc., etc. So I'll kind of go through each one of these and why you would play these in the flex slots in addition to the stock version of the list. First off, this Dead Gone is just more additional early removal for aggressive decks or Ragavan or things like that. Mystical Dispute, if you plan on playing against more blue decks, especially main deck, Mystical Dispute can really get them. Brazen Borrower, which is one of the cards that I play. allowing us to have interaction with our opponent and even Teferis that is unconditional is just so powerful. Plus, having an additional aggressive card is also very good. Bone Crusher Giant is really good against the One Ring. Often we're trying to have like really big attacks, and the One Ring can slow us down and let our opponent stabilize. But if we Bone Crusher Giant, specifically if we Stomp, it says damage can't be prevented, which stops protection. Also, being an additional creature is awesome. Flame of Honor I've already talked about, but just a really versatile card that we can play at instant speed. We can make them fear the combo and play Flame of Honor instead. Main deck Artifact Hate's really strong. Additional removal is really strong. Subtlety for that additional hate versus Teferi, but also reasonable interaction with a lot of decks. Shieldred is one of the new hotnesses of the deck, and remember, if you put Shieldred in your deck, you'll have to change up the mana base a bit. It becomes a 5-color Rhinos deck. But this is a way to tackle the new Beans deck. It's playing up to 3. I've seen 4, but I put 3 in the flex slots because Beans is not a May, and we can kind of just deal so much damage if they never answer that Shieldred, which is pretty cool. Questing Beast is another answer, and a really interesting answer, sort of to Teferi, because we can attack them, redirect the damage to Teferi, but also just like another really awesome threat. And then Murktide Regent, just another additional threat to play in that sort of diverse threat flex slot. You should be picking 6 of these cards. And then as far as our sideboard goes, we've already talked about Mystical Dispute, Brazen Borrower, Subtlety. Commandeer is a really cool card that is becoming more popular in Modern. Gaining control of a non-creature spell, you may choose new targets for the copy. And you can cast it for free by exiling 2 blue cards from your hand rather than playing the spell's mana cost. This can be a version of Force of Negation because the way that you can resolve Commandeer is technically it can counter a spell. I guess technically it can't, but you can redirect the spell to Commandeer, which is effectively countering it, because Commandeer needs to enter the stack and needs to be like literally resolving as you choose new targets for the copy of the spell. So in that way, it can sort of be another Force of Negation for counter magic, but also stealing like a Fable of the Mirror Breaker or stealing your opponent's Teferi or really any of this stuff is just really, really powerful. Though siding and Commandeer can make sideboarding a little bit hard because you want to make sure you have a lot of blue cards in your deck. Blood Moon, really good against the 4-color decks, really solid against Urza Saga, things like that. Fury for more interaction with opponent's creatures and Teferis. Obsidian Charmaw for Tron decks. The 4th Endurance for additional Graveyard Hate. The 4th Force of Rigor for additional Beans, Enchantment, and Artifact Hate. And up to 2 Beseiju for more additional Enchantment and Artifact Hate. So you'd pick 7 of these cards to play in your sideboard, in addition to the 8 cards that are totally stock. So that being said, this is the configuration that I enjoy playing. And I wanted to talk about some kind of neat interactions in the deck. Now, first off, and I think I already mentioned this one, Violent Outburst, weirdly enough, is a little bit better than Shardless Agent. Mostly because if you Violent Outburst at the end of your opponent's turn, it allows you to be able to Force of Negation, because Force of Negation you need to cast when it's not your turn, and fight over it at the end of your opponent's turn. And then often you can get them to tap out, especially if you have Force of Negation, and even if they have 2 pieces of counter magic to counter Crashing Footfalls and Force of Negation, then you can untap, and if you have either Violent Outburst or Shardless Agent in your hand, you can just cast that during your main phase while your opponent's tapped out, and get your Rhinos that way. Some other cool interactions is, remember with Otawara, you can bounce your own Shardless Agent to be able to replay it, and thus cascade again into Crashing Footfalls. And remember, you can always suspend Crashing Footfalls on turn 1. That's kind of scary. Though it's really frustrating because you have to cast it during your upkeep, and if they cast a Teferi the turn before, it just kind of fizzles. And it's really important to remember when we sideboard, which we'll talk about sideboarding in just a bit, that we have enough cards to be able to evoke our Fury and Solitude and to be able to Force of Negation, like cards in those colors. That's something to be incredibly conscious about if we can be. That being said, let's talk about sideboarding with the 4-color Rhinos deck. I'm just going to go through the decks that I think are playable and how I would sideboard against them, with a little bit of explanation if I feel like it's not super obvious. The most popular deck in Modern is the Red-Black Scam, also known as Red-Black Evoke. We're going to side in Endurance. Endurance is just another way that we can answer their turn 1 scam, and another creature we can play to block their grief, and another creature we can play and an early threat that they need to answer. We're going to be bringing in Besejus, mostly because there's quite a few cards we need out of our deck in order to play this matchup, and additional lands is totally fine. It's really important we hit our land drops in order to just like be able to cast our cards, because they're going to scam us. And being able to snipe like a Fable of the Mirror Breaker or something like that is pretty powerful. Plus, being able to deal with a preemptive Engineered Explosives or a Chalice of the Void is wildly important. And we're going to be bringing in one of our Furies because we have to take out our Force of Negations or Mystical Dispute. By the way, Beseju, we're bringing in over Force of Vigor for the Chalice of the Void answer. Which, by the way, we have other answers like Brazen Borrower and Flame of Honor and stuff like that. But this Beseju can't be scammed. Can't be taken out of our hand by Grief or Thoughtseize. But these cards are not good. Obviously, Mystical Dispute, like there's no blue cards in our opponent's deck. And Force of Negation is really not that good, mostly because in its best scenario, you're stopping a scam. But when that happens, they can Grief your hand first. And then you need to wait until you can Force of Negation the card that they're casting on Grief. And it's really hard to make sure that you have like two Force of Negate or two pieces of interaction and an additional blue because they're going to take one piece of interaction. It's just unrealistic. So we're not using Force of Negation. So this is how sideboarding and scam. The second most popular deck is the 4-color Omnath deck. Against 4-color Omnath, we're bringing in Mystical Dispute because it counters quite a few things in their deck. We're bringing in Beseju for the Leyline Binding, Up the Beanstalk, Chalice of the Void, stuff like that. We are bringing in the Commandeer. There's a lot of juicy spells in our opponent's deck, specifically the One Ring that we can grab. Bringing in Blood Moon because we can really snipe their mana base. We're taking out Dead Gone because it doesn't really deal with anything, and returning things to our opponent's hand is really bad because everything has Enter the Battlefield effects. Bringing out Fury, and then we're shaving on Murktide Regent, mostly because it's really bad against Leyline Binding. And this is how I sideboard against 4-color Omnath. Next deck is the Rhinos deck, is the Mirror Match, where we're going to be bringing in Furies. Answers Rhinos really, really well. Bringing in Mystical Dispute so we can fight the Counter War, and Commandeer so that we can continue to fight the Counter War, or even steal our opponent's Crashing Footfalls, which is hilarious. We're bringing out Subtlety because we don't really care about the creatures that they're casting for the most part. And we're bringing out the Flame of Honor because, like, really the best version of this is the removal. Removal doesn't really do that much. And I'm not sure if we care about playing a 3-mana spell that draws 2 cards, so this is what we're going to side in the Mirror Match. Next most popular deck is Amulet Titan, where we're going to be bringing in Blood Moon. Blood Moon is amazing against the 2-mana lands, also great against Urza Saga. Bringing in Beseju to be able to answer the amulets, also fine against the 2-mana lands. Bringing in Force for Vigors for the amulets, and Force of Vigors actually, and Beseju for that matter, is awesome against the Dryad. Bringing out Mystical Disputes, it is not a blue deck. Bringing out the Fury, it really only answers the Dryad, and we have plenty of answers to that card. And then we're bringing out Dead Gone. It doesn't really kill anything, and we don't really want to return anything to their hands. This is how I sideboard against Amulet. Next most popular deck is Yawgmoth. We're bringing in Beseju. It's really important to be able to answer the Cauldron. An additional land is totally fine. Bringing in Fury, it's a creature deck. And we're bringing in Endurance to see if we can break up the stuff that's going on in the graveyard, especially now that the Soul Cauldron is being played in the deck, but also it's really good against Undying cards. Bringing out Force of Negation, there's not a lot of non-creature spells that we super duper care about. In addition, Mystical Dispute, it is not a blue deck, and then we're going to shave on a Murktide Regent, because Murktide Regent we have to invest quite a bit in very often. To just get killed is kind of lame, so it's high sideboard against Yawgmoth. Next most popular deck is Murktide, speaking of. We're going to be siding in a Commandeer. Getting an Expressive Iteration or like stopping their counter magic is really powerful. Endurance to kind of keep their graveyard under control because of DRC and Murktide. And Mystical Dispute to help us with that counter war even further. We're going to be bringing out Fury because there's not a lot of cards in the deck that we super duper care about. And getting a Evoked Fury countered is a nightmare. Bringing out Fire Ice, it only really kills Ragavan. And we're bringing out a Dead Gone for the same reasons. We're keeping in a number of Dead Gone, mostly for that Ragavan kill. This is how I sideboard against Murktide. Next deck is Burn. We're bringing in Endurance, mostly for an early blocker, just additional cards. We're bringing in Commandeer because Commandeer is hilarious against the burn spells. Bringing out a Fury. Go to Murktide Regent and out to Mystical Disputes just because it's a lot of mana investment. We're likely never going to cast these. Fury can be okay, but almost all the cards we'd be evoking, we can just cast to be able to kill their creatures anyway, and Dead Gone and Fire and whatever. So this is how I sideboard against Burn. Next decks we're going to do together is Hardened Scales and Hammer Time. We're going to sideboard the same against both. Beseju for the artifacts and enchantments. Force of Vigor for the artifacts and enchantments. Fury for the creatures that we care about if we can. Yeah, that part can be like a little bit sketchy. Out Mystical Dispute, out with Murktide because the decks are fast. We're not really going to be able to fill our graveyard super duper quick. And out with Force of Negations. There's not a lot of non-creature spells that we hyper care about is worth 2 for 1ing ourselves with. We have plenty of interaction otherwise. So it's high sideboard against both Hammer Time and Hardened Scales. The next deck is Tron. We're going to be bringing in Blood Moon. Blood Moon is famously good against Tron. Beseju, very good against Tron lands. Also some artifacts sometimes. Commandeer because it's hilarious to be able to steal a Karn the Great Creator or a Karn Liberated or anything like that. Force of Vigor for the artifacts, just another way that we might be able to deal with stuff. Also very good against like Urza Saga and whatever. And we're going to be bringing out a lot of our removal. We're bringing out Dead Gone. Mystical Dispute is pretty medium. Fury doesn't really answer anything besides like Karn the Great Creator after it's already done its thing. And we're going to be siding out of a Brazen Borrower. We don't really need to keep Brazen Borrower in for Chalice of the Void because we have plenty of other stuff that we can use. So it's like sideboard against Tron. The next deck is against Living End. We're going to be bringing in Endurance, obviously, to be able to deal with the graveyard and interrupt the combo. We're going to bring Mystical Dispute just as another way to fight this counter war. Bringing out Fury. Just removal is generally bad because if we need removal, then things have gone horribly wrong. We're bringing out Fury and out Dead Gone, and that's how we sideboard against Living End. Next deck is Zoo. Against Zoo, we're just be bringing in our Furies and bringing out our Mystical Disputes. I don't think it's worth fighting the counter war there. I'd rather just like answer their creatures and threaten doing our thing. So that's how I like sideboarding here. And then the last deck that we're going to talk about how to sideboard against is the Cascade Beans deck. Against Beans, we're going to be bringing in Blood Moon. They do have basics in their deck, but they can't really fetch basics that often because the newer versions of the deck are now like 5-color. Boseiju is really solid against the Tri-lands and also against Beanstalk. Force of Vigor is literally insane against Up the Beanstalk. Mystical Dispute because they have a lot of blue cards in their deck. They're siding out of Dead Gone, similar to Omnath. There's not a lot of cards that answers. Siding out because we don't really want to be 2-for-1ing ourselves. In addition to Murktide. Murktide's just really bad against Leyline Binding. Brazen Borrower is kind of medium as well. And then we're going to be siding out of Fire Ice. And so that's how I sideboard against the Cascade Beans deck. And so hopefully you enjoyed the deep dive, the look at flex slots, the look at the stock portion of the list, overall strategy of the deck, sort of how to play the deck, some little nuances with the deck, and how to sideboard against the decks that I think are good in Modern. If you like videos like this, please be sure to like and subscribe. Check me out on social medias. Links are above me and in the description. Also check out the Patreon where we have written sideboard guides and stuff all out in addition to some other stuff that I'm putting on there. I'd really appreciate that. Again, links are above me and in the description for that as well. Thank you all so much for watching. I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.